Welcome back to the Unfiltered podcast brought to you by the Elite Service Group. Guys, this is Technician to Technician. Today we're going to be speaking to all of our technicians out there. We're going to be answering questions that we gathered off the internet, so bear with me, follow along, and if you don't know the answer to these, write them down. Guys, if you're a homeowner out there listening, please follow along, so when your technician is speaking to you, you kind of are familiar with all the vocabulary. So to begin, we're going to answer a very common question. What is superheat? What is subcooling? Guys, it's very obvious that this has to do with air conditioning. So if you're in the air conditioning season, please follow along with this question. What is superheat? So superheat is the temperature that changes at the condensing unit. You know, we're going to be very vague with these questions. So if you want to learn further, please feel free to dive into what I'm talking about. So the superheat, that has to do with your condenser, and the subcooling has to do with your evaporator. So make sure you check your superheats. Make sure you check subcooling, because this is how you speak to your unit. Looking at these numbers is basically how you figure out how your system's running. So what is the difference between R22, R410A, and R454B? Guys, these are all multiple different refrigerants. If you are doing air conditioning, you borderline need to know chemistry. So these are all different makeups of all different gases. So guys, look into it. You know what I'm saying? I know all this because I went to years and years and years of schooling to figure out and look at these charts. So the difference is they're all different types of gases. You cannot mix these gases. Gases do not mix. So just please notice that. If you want to learn further, please feel free to look it up. How do I calculate target superheat? Guys, it's a formula. We're not going to go over the formula in this video, but look up your superheat formula. All right. How much refrigerant is precharged in the factory unit? Guys, this one, please pay attention, okay? Each unit has a different weight of refrigerant in the unit itself. You have to look on the name tag and be familiar with the serial and model numbers to understand this information. It will tell you, and then you have your line set. So typically you're good for 15 foot of line set. If you're within that boundaries, then whatever is contained in the condenser, you should be good for 15 to 20 feet. How do I check if a capacitor is bad? Guys, when you're in the cooling season, if your air conditioner or your customer's air conditioner is not working, there's a couple things we go to. I immediately go to the condenser and see if that's running. As long as your thermostat is set to cooling and you're trying to hit a desired temperature, your condenser should be running. So if it's not running, you got two things to worry about. That's your contactor and that's your capacitor. So make sure you're checking your capacitance. You read that in microfarads. So if you take a microfarad reading and it's not the rating of the capacitor, you're probably out of capacitance, which means you need a new capacitor. All right, so all my technicians out there, how do I check if the capacitor is bad? Microfarads. Take your microfarad reading. If that does not match the rating of the capacitor is out of capacity, so go ahead and replace it. How do I test the thermostat for signal? Guys, you're looking for a 24 volt reading. If you don't have that, it has something to do with the way the 24 volts is being delivered, which brings you back to the thermostat. How do I measure static pressure? Guys, if you're measuring static pressure, you need a manometer. The manometer will tell you exactly how many microns your ductwork is reading. Make sure you use those. It's called static pressure. How can I tell if the blower motor is a ECM or a PSC? All right, guys, you got to know the vocabulary here. So a PSC is a permanent split capacitor. All right, that motor needs a capacitor. Your ECM motors, those are different, okay? If you have a plug with a bunch of different wires going into your ECM motor, it probably is an ECM. Those don't have capacitors. They don't have split capacitors. So that's how you can tell if your motor has a capacitor on the outside or not. So that's how you can tell if that's a ECM or a PSC. All right, let's get into heating since we're getting into the heating season. What's the difference between single stage and two stage and modulating furnaces? So the stages have to do with the capacity and how much heating you actually need for these spaces. So if you have a single stage, that will run full blast all the time, no matter if you're a degree off or 10 degrees off. You're basically using more fuel to get to the desired temperature faster. If you have two stages, you're using a lower stage and a higher stage. So if you're only a couple degrees off, you'll probably be running a lower stage. And then once you don't achieve that temperature in a certain time frame, typically the other stage kicks on, and that kind of covers the two stages. Modulating furnaces, that's a totally different ball game. They use a lot of sensors to kind of see how long it takes to heat the space. If you're not achieving that, it will ramp up and down. So that's kind of the difference between the single, the two two-stage and the modulating furnaces. How do I test if a flame sensor is good? If you don't know this, go back to school, guys. And if you are, I'll tell you how to read them. So basically, it's a microamp reading. You hook up your meter, and your meter has to be able to read microamps, but you hook them up and you see if you have the proper microamp reading, guys. That's how you check your flame sensors. All right, just a couple more here. These are pretty simple ones. Why is my suction line freezing? There's only a couple reasons why that will happen. The refrigerant charge, the return air. So do you have a clean filter or a dirty one? And airflow. So if you have all those and you're hitting your markers, you shouldn't have a freezing line. So it has to do with one of those three things. Why is my system short cycling? This is a very advanced question. So this is for the real technicians out there. If your system is short cycling, you have to hit your basic factors. How much refrigerant is in the system? Start there. Look at your numbers. If your subcooling and your superheat are where they should be, then you should be running perfectly fine. But that's basically how you speak to the system and see why it's short cycling. I can go on and on about the different symptoms that can go for, dirty condenser, overheating, stuff like that. But, you really have to dive in and figure out why that system's short cycling. But anyway, that's basically it when it comes to tech questions. If you guys have any more, please feel free to comment, like, subscribe, follow us. You guys are the reasons why this channel is able to stay up and keep bringing you guys information. So please like, subscribe, and we'll get back to you next week.